Hello, this is the Deep Frame Podcast. This is where we slow things down, strip away narrative theater, and look at what actually exists underneath the headlines, the insinuations, and the emotionally engineered conclusions. Today, we're dealing with something very specific and very deliberately distorted. The way Andrew and Tristan Tate, Donald Trump, and Jeffrey Epstein are being rhetorically fused together in public discourse, despite being legally, factually, and procedurally separate realities. This is not a defense of Epstein. Epstein was a convicted sex offender, a trafficker, and a criminal whose actions are documented, adjudicated, and morally indefensible. That distinction matters, and if it disappears, everything else collapses with it. Let's start where the manipulation actually begins. Legal status versus narrative certainty. Andrew and Tristan Tate are not in prison. That is not opinion. That is not spin. That is the current legal reality. They were arrested in Romania in late 2022, held in pre-trial detention, then placed under judicial control and house arrest. Their case remains active. That means accusations exist, indictments exist, and proceedings are ongoing. It does not mean guilt has been legally established. It does not mean evidence has been tested in open court. It does not mean verdicts exist. That's not semantics. That's the entire structure of due process. At the same time, UK prosecutors have authorized charges that are pending extradition, contingent on the conclusion of Romanian proceedings. In the United States, there has been investigative interest. But again, investigations are not convictions. None of this is unusual in cross-border cases involving multiple jurisdictions. What is unusual is the way this legal complexity is flattened into a single implied conclusion for public consumption. This is where narrative replaces law. Now, let's address the Trump connection, because this is where implication is doing all the work that evidence is not. There is no record of a pardon. There is no executive action wiping charges. There is no judicial ruling dismissing cases at Trump's request. What exists are reports of political proximity, conversations, and influence attempts. That's not illegal by itself. It's also not proof of interference. It's proximity, not casualty. Yes, the Tate brothers publicly aligned themselves with certain conservative figures prior to their arrest. That's a strategic move, not a confession. Yes, media outlets have reported that diplomatic figures associated with a Trump administration contacts communicated with Romanian officials around the time travel restrictions were eased. That does not equal legal exoneration, nor does it equal obstruction. It means political pressure was allegedly applied, which is something governments do constantly, often openly and often without altering judicial outcomes. Here's the key point people avoid. If political influence alone invalidated legal systems, then no high-profile case anywhere would be legitimate. Influence is not evidence. Access is not guilt. Conversation is not conspiracy. And then comes the Epstein comparison, which is where intellectual dishonesty peaks. Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein existed in overlapping elite social circles decades ago. Photos exist. Social interactions occurred. That is not disputed. What is also not disputed is that no investigation has produced criminal charges, findings, or judgments tying Trump to Epstein's crime. None. Not civil, not criminal, not sealed, not unsealed, not pending. If association alone were enough, then the Epstein case would have consumed dozens of powerful figures across politics, finance, and media, and academia. It didn't, because association is not a prosecutable standard. Behavior is. And this is why Epstein's name is now being reused as a rhetorical accelerant. You don't need to prove anything new when you borrow an existing moral verdict. You just place it nearby and let implications do the rest. That's not justice, that's narrative contamination. The Tate and Epstein comparison operates the same way. Both involve accusations labeled under the same legal category, sex trafficking. That's where the similarity ends. One case resulted in conviction, the other has not. One involved documented networks, plea deals, and corroborated victims across decades. The other is still in procedural motion with contested evidence, contested testimony, and unresolved trials. To collapse those distinctions is not analytical, it's strategic. Now, let's talk about why this happens. High-profile figures who openly reject institutional authority, cultural consensus, or moral framing systems become symbolic threats. Once that happens, the individual stops being treated as a person and starts being treated as a message to others. The goal is no longer to adjudicate what they did, but to define what happens if you resemble them. This is why timing matters. This is why language matters. This is why the word alleged quietly disappears while the emotional conclusion stays fixed. This is why outcomes are implied years before trials begin. And this is also why Epstein is treated differently. Epstein doesn't threaten the system anymore. He's contained. He's resolved. He's usable as a symbol precisely because there is no ambiguity left. That makes him safe to reference. What should concern anyone paying attention is not whether you like Trump or the Tate brothers. It's whether accusations has now replaced proof as the threshold for social annihilation. Because once that shift happens, innocence stops being something you establish and becomes something you're expected to perform indefinitely. That's not how law works. That's how power works when it's afraid of scrutiny. And here's the final point, because this is where the entire thing either holds together or collapses. If evidence is strong, it survives process. If guilt is real, it doesn't need narrative, shortcuts. If a case is solid, it welcomes scrutiny instead of rushing to moral closure. The moment you are told that asking for procedural clarity is itself suspicious, you're no longer being asked to reason. You're being asked to submit. That's the deep frame. Not who is innocent, not who is guilty, but whether truth still has to earn conclusions or whether conclusions are now allowed to manufacture truth afterward. That's the line. And that's why this matters.